The CNN studio lights blazed down on what was supposed to be a routine discussion panel, but within seconds it became clear this would be anything but routine. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi's voice echoed through the studio as she pointed an accusatory finger across the table. "You have no idea what real law enforcement looks like," she screamed at American actor Jonathan Roumie. "You're nothing but a progressive activist playing dress up with these serious issues, not someone who understands the complexities of law and order." The tension in that studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 5 million viewers watched live as what started as a civil debate about criminal justice reform turned into a verbal battlefield. Pam Bondi, red-faced and trembling with anger, had just unleashed a personal attack that crossed every line of professional conduct. But what happened next would leave her speechless and create a moment that would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform. Jonathan Roumie sat perfectly still, his hands folded calmly on the table, watching Bondi's outburst with the composed attention of someone who had faced intense scrutiny before. The contrast was striking. One woman losing complete control, the other maintaining perfect composure. What happened in the next 30 seconds didn't just end the debate. It redefined what a voice of empathy and reason could look like in the modern age of political commentary. Before we dive into this incredible confrontation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these explosive moments that are changing the conversation in America. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two powerful figures are and what brought them to this moment of inevitable collision. Their backgrounds couldn't be more different, and those differences would play out dramatically on live television. Pam Bondi had built her career as Florida's Attorney General from 2011 to 2019, establishing herself as one of the most aggressive conservative prosecutors in the country. She'd made her name going after everything from pill mills to human trafficking operations, always with the cameras rolling and her blonde hair perfectly styled for maximum media impact. Bondi understood the power of television and had spent years crafting her image as the tough talking prosecutor who wasn't afraid to take on anyone. After leaving office, she transitioned into the world of political commentary and legal analysis, appearing regularly on conservative news networks, where her fiery personality and willingness to attack democratic policies made her a favorite among right-wing audiences. She built a following of people who saw her as a straight shooter who would tell the hard truths that career politicians wouldn't dare speak. But Bondi had also caught controversy throughout her career. Critics pointed to her cozy relationship with Donald Trump, including a $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation to her political committee just days before she decided not to join a multi-state lawsuit against Trump University. That decision had raised serious questions about her ethics and independence, questions that had followed her into her media career. On the other side of that CNN table sat American actor Jonathan Roumie. At 49, he had carved a unique path to public prominence, not through politics or law, but through the arts. Born in New York City, Jonathan had a diverse acting career, but he became a global phenomenon for his portrayal of Jesus in the critically acclaimed series The Chosen. This role in particular had catapulted him into the public eye, making him a figure associated with a compassion, deep humanity, and a profound spiritual message. He often used his platform to speak about themes of forgiveness, mercy, and the inherent dignity of every person, advocating for a more compassionate and understanding society. Unlike Bondi's high-profile prosecutorial career, Jonathan had spent his time delving into the human condition, bringing complex characters to life, and connecting with audiences on an emotional and spiritual level. When he accepted the invitation to appear on the CNN panel, it was as an engaged citizen and artist concerned with the human impact of criminal justice, rather than a policy expert or a legislator. He had spoken in various forums about the need for empathy in public discourse and the importance of addressing societal challenges with a focus on human dignity, drawing from his experiences and the universal lessons often found in storytelling. What's fascinating about watching these two individuals in action is how their different backgrounds shape their approaches to public discussion. Drop a comment below and let us know which style of influence resonates more with you. The media-savvy prosecutor or the empathetic actor known for bringing profound stories to life. The criminal justice reform debate that brought these two Bondi, it was about defending the law enforcement community she'd worked with throughout her career and pushing back against what she saw as dangerous progressive policies that would make communities less safe. For Jonathan, it was about advocating for systemic empathy, understanding the human stories behind the statistics, and exploring avenues for redemption and true societal healing, reflecting the themes he often explored in his work. What neither probably expected was how personal this debate would become and how quickly professional disagreement would turn into something much more intense and revealing. The CNN segment had started innocently enough. Host Anderson Cooper introduced both individuals and laid out the topic. Recent proposals for criminal justice reform and their potential impact on public safety. For the first few minutes, both Bondi and Roumie stuck to their talking points, presenting their different perspectives with the kind of professional courtesy you'd expect from experienced public figures. Bondi argued that many of the proposed reforms would handcuff law enforcement and make it harder to keep dangerous criminals off the streets. She cited statistics about crime rates and spoke passionately about the need to support police officers who risk their lives every day to protect communities. Her arguments were well rehearsed and delivered with the confidence of someone who'd spent years in front of cameras. Jonathan countered with a focus on the human impact of the justice system, emphasizing the importance of restorative justice, rehabilitation, and addressing the root causes of crime while still maintaining public safety. He spoke about the need for accountability across the board and the importance of rebuilding trust between communities and those who serve them, weaving in themes of compassion and potential for human transformation. His responses were measured and thoughtful, citing examples of successful community programs and the moral imperative for a system that upholds the dignity of every person. But you could feel the tension building with each exchange. Bondi's voice was getting slightly sharper, her gestures more animated. When Jonathan mentioned the need for systemic empathy, Bondi's jaw tightened visibly. When Jonathan cited statistics about the impact of long sentences on families, Bondi shifted in her chair and began shaking her head. The breaking point came when Anderson Cooper asked about qualified immunity for police officers, a legal doctrine that protects government officials from being sued for actions taken in their official capacity. It's a complex legal issue that requires nuanced discussion, but it had become a political flashpoint in debates about police reform. Jonathan began explaining his perspective carefully, noting that he believed in upholding the dignity of all individuals, including officers, but that accountability was crucial for maintaining public trust and ensuring true justice. He was in the middle of describing the importance of transparency and community oversight when Bondi interrupted him. That's exactly the kind of naive thinking that gets people killed, Bondi said, her voice rising. You sit in your comfortable Hollywood bubble playing pretend and dream up these theoretical reforms while real police officers are out there risking their lives every single day. You're an actor, not a policymaker. Jonathan tried to respond calmly, pointing out that his insights came from deep engagement with human stories and understanding the struggles people faced. But Bondi was just getting started. Don't lecture me about law enforcement, Bondi continued, her voice getting louder. I've prosecuted more criminals than you've probably even met. I've seen what happens when bleeding-heart liberals and soft-hearted artists tie the hands of good cops trying to do their jobs. The personal nature of the attack was already crossing professional lines. But Anderson Cooper tried to steer the conversation back to policy specifics. He asked Jonathan to respond to Bondi's concerns about officer safety, giving him an opportunity to de-escalate the situation. Instead of rising to the bait, Jonathan remained calm and professional. I think we all want safe communities and accountable individuals, he said. The question is how we achieve both goals simultaneously, with a focus on compassion and human dignity. But his measured response seemed to infuriate Bondi even more. Perhaps she was expecting Jonathan to fight fire with fire, to engage in the kind of shouting match that makes for viral television clips. When Jonathan refused to take the bait, Bondi seemed to lose whatever self-control she had left. You know what your problem is, Bondi said, pointing her finger across the table. You've never had to make the tough decisions. You've never had to look a victim's family in the eye and explain why a dangerous criminal is back on the streets because of soft on-crime policies. Jonathan started to respond, Stories don't keep communities safe. Real prosecutors like me do the hard work of keeping communities safe, not actors who talk about empathy and dignity. The attack was now completely personal and professional, questioning not just Jonathan's perspectives, but his entire profession and character. Anderson Cooper looked stunned, clearly not expecting this level of personal animosity on what was supposed to be a policy discussion. But Bondi wasn't finished. The cameras kept rolling as she launched into a tirade that would soon become infamous across social media. You have no idea what real law enforcement looks like, she continued screaming. You're nothing but a progressive activist playing a role, dressing up these complex issues for show, not understanding the real grit of it. You sit in Hollywood and pass judgment on people who've actually done the work, who've actually put criminals behind bars, who've actually made communities safer. Her face was red now, her voice reaching levels that made the studio microphones crackle slightly. You want to defund the police? You want to eliminate cash bail? You want to turn our streets into a free-for-all for criminals? And when crime goes up, when people get hurt, you'll blame everyone except your own failed policies and your soft-hearted idealism. The studio fell completely silent, except for Bondi's heavy breathing as she finished her outburst. Even Anderson Cooper seemed momentarily speechless, probably calculating whether they should go to commercial break or try to salvage the segment. Jonathan had sat through the entire tirade without saying a word, without changing his expression, without even uncrossing his hands. The contrast between Bondi's explosive anger and Jonathan's serene composure was striking, and would soon become the defining image of this confrontation. The cameras captured every second as Jonathan looked directly at Bondi, then slowly turned to face the camera and the millions of viewers watching at home. What he said next would not only end the debate, but create one of the most talked about moments in recent political television history. The silence in that CNN studio stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Pam Bondi sat back in her chair, breathing heavily from her outburst, apparently convinced she had just delivered a devastating blow that would leave Jonathan Roumie speechless and humiliated. Anderson Cooper looked back and forth between the two, clearly unsure how to proceed after witnessing such an unprecedented breakdown of professional conduct on live television. Then Jonathan Roumie did something that no one expected. He smiled, not a smirk or a condescending grin, but a genuine, almost warm smile that seemed to light up his entire face. He took a slow, deliberate breath, adjusted his position slightly in his chair, and spoke in a voice so calm and clear that it created an almost shocking contrast to the screaming that had just filled the studio. Ms. Bondi, he began, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. I want to thank you for that demonstration. You've just shown the American people exactly what I've been talking about when I discuss the need for empathy, dignity, and a focus on human stories in our justice system, rather than just anger and accusation. The words hit like a precision-guided missile. Instead of defending himself against Bondi's attacks, Jonathan had turned the entire outburst into evidence, supporting his own argument. But he was just getting started. You mentioned it that I've never had to make tough decisions or look victims' families in the eye. You believe that because I am an actor, I cannot comprehend the depths of human suffering or the yearning for justice. Jonathan continued, his voice never wavered from that calm conversational tone. Let me tell you, Ms. Bondi, my work is precisely about stepping into the shoes of others, understanding their pain, their joy, their struggles. Every role I undertake, especially playing a figure like Jesus, demands an intense immersion into the human condition, into the nature of suffering, injustice, and the profound need for mercy and redemption. What happened next was a masterclass in how to respond to personal attacks with substance and a different kind of authority. Jonathan began systematically dismantling not just Bondi's argument, but the entire persona she'd built her career on, not with legal counter-argument, but with a moral and humanistic framework. During my preparation for roles and in my advocacy outside of acting, I've spent time listening to countless individuals affected by our justice. I've heard the stories of Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who, like countless others, found herself caught in a system that seemed designed to crush hope rather than foster rehabilitation. Her story, though not a headline, is just as real as any you've prosecuted. He paused, letting that sink in, then continued. I've heard from James Washington, a veteran who, like many, felt abandoned and targeted by the very system meant to protect him. His fight for dignity, his journey toward healing, are as vivid and impactful as any courtroom. The specific details were devastating because they weren't talking or statistics alone. These were real humans, articulated with the empathy of someone who deeply understood storytelling and human. And Jonathan was delivering them with the precision of someone who had absorbed these experiences rather than just read about them. You talk about keeping communities safe, Jonathan. But what about keeping communities safe? Rehabilitation, through addressing mental health, through fostering true community bond. What about the safety of people like Sandra, who called for help during a domestic violence and ended up getting caught in a system that prioritized over human understanding? Anderson Cooper was leaning forward, completely absorbed in what was becoming not just a response to Bondi's attacks, but a clinic in how a different perspective could illuminate complexities of criminal justice. But Jonathan wasn't finished addressing Bondi's record directly, shifting slightly to challenge her integrity. You mentioned that you've prosecuted more criminals than I've probably met. Let's talk about the integrity of your approach to justice, shall we? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Jonathan shifted into what could only be described as a calm, ethical cross-examination. During your time as Florida Attorney General, your office had a conviction rate of 90%, which sounds impressive until you realize that the national average is unmet. More importantly, your office was reversed on appeal more than 180 times for prosecutorial misconduct, evidence tamper, and violations of defendants' constitutional rights. Bondi's face went from red to pale as Jonathan continued with surgical precision. Your office was also investigated for accepting that $25,000 from Donald Trump's family just before you decided not to join the lawsuit against Trump. Funny how you lecture me about making tough decisions when your own choices raise serious questions about your ethical independence and where the facts were hitting like hammer. But Jonathan delivered them without race or showing it. The contrast with Bondi's earlier couldn't have been more stark. But here's what really bothers me about your attacks as an actor and my perspective, Jonathan said, turning to look directly at Bondi the first time. When you dismiss the voices of artists, of advocates, of anyone who seeks to bring empathy and a focus on human dignity discussion, you are attacking a crucial part of our collective conscience. You're attacking the very principle that true justice requires understanding, not just punishment. He paused, then delivered what would become the quoted entire. A person who owns these problems through the lens of accusation and punishment and dismisses the power of empathy and human transfer understands only part of what truth demands. The silence that follows deafening. Bondi sat frozen, apparently unable to formulate any response to the systematic dismantling of her arguments and her credibility. Anderson Cooper looked like he was watching a masterclass in communication, but Jonathan had one final point, and it would prove to be the most devastating of all. You know what the real difference between us, Ms. Bondi? He asked, his voice growing slightly stronger. When you see problems in the justice system, you blame activists, you blame progressive policy, you blame soft-hearted ideals, you blame everyone except the systemic failures themselves, and you perpetuate a cycle of anger and division. When I see problems, I see opportunity to cultivate empathy, to tell stories that bridge divides, and to advocate for a system that upholds the dignity of every person. He leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact with Bondi. You spent 8 years as Attorney General, and your solution to every problem is to prosecute more people and build more prison. I've spent my career focusing on the human story, on the journey of transformation and redemption, and I believe stories have the power to change hearts, to illuminate truth, and ultimately to inspire systems to evolve beyond mere retribution. The final blow was delivered, the quiet confidence of someone who had facts, a profound moral perspective, an unwavering composure. Pam Bondi, who had started the segment thinking she would embarrass and silence an actor, had instead been thoroughly outclassed by someone who combined deep empathy with intellectual rigor and an unshakable inner calm. As Anderson Cooper finally found his transition commercial break, viewers across the country were already reaching for their phone to share clips of what they had. This wasn't just a political debate anymore. It was a defining moment that would reshape how people thought about leadership, accountability, and what it means to serve the public. even from outside traditional political roles. The aftermath of that CNN confrontation was immediate and explosive. Within minutes of the segment ending, social media platforms across the began lighting up with clips, reaction, and commentary. The hashtag Roumie responds began trending on Twitter within 20 minutes, followed shortly by hashtag Pam Bondi. Facebook groups dedicated to political discussion found themselves overwhelmed with posts analyzing every word of the exchange. But it wasn't just social media buzz. Major news outlets that had initially ignored what they thought would be a routine panel were suddenly scrambling to cover what was quickly being recognized as one of the most significant moments. CNN's own website crashed temporarily from the traffic surge as millions of people tried to watch the full video of the conference. The immediate reactions fell along predictable, but what was surprising was how many conservatives found themselves impressed by Jonathan's performance, even if they disagreed with some of his broader points. "I don't agree with this," wrote one popular conservative blogger, "but you have to respect how he handled that situation." Bondi completely lost control and Roumie stayed professional while still hitting back with a different kind of power. Professional political analysts and communication were even more impressed. "What we witnessed wasn't just good television," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, a political communication professor at Georgetown University. "Jonathan Roumie demonstrated a level of preparation, composure, strategic thinking that's rare in modern." He turned a personal attack into profound discussion about human dignity, systemic empathy, using his opponent's aggression against her to highlight a different path forward. The numbers told the story of the confrontation's impact. The original CNN segment had been watched by about 5 million, but within 48 hours, various clips and compilations had been viewed more than 50 million times across all platforms. Late-night comedy shows exchanged, with several hosts praising Jonathan's calm yet devastating response. More importantly, the confrontation had real consequences. Pam Bondi, who had been building a career on conservative networks, suddenly found several planned appearances quietly canceled. Bookers, who had previously valued her willingness to attack, now worried that she had become a liability. Her agent later confirmed that 3 different television shows had dropped her from their regular rotation. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie's representatives reported being overwhelmed with positive calls and emails from supporters nation praising his composure. More significantly, his team received hundreds of inquiries from organizations involved in restorative community outreach and interfaith dialogue, seeking his involvement and perspective. He became a sought-after speaker for events focused on bridging divides and fostering compassion. The confrontation also highlighted the broader shift happening in public discourse. For years, television bookers had prioritized guests who would create fireworks and generate controversy, often at the expense of substance or factual accuracy. But the Bondi Roumie exchange demonstrated that viewers were hungry for something different, for voices who could be strong without being passionate, without being unprofessional, and grounded in a different kind of moral authority. What Jonathan Roumie showed, explained veteran political strategist James Morrison, is that you don't have to sink to your opponent's level to win a confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful response to someone screaming is to speak more quietly, not more loudly, and to pivot the conversation to deeper, more human. The impact extended beyond politics into academic and humanistic circles. Communications departments began using clips of the exchange to teach students about persuasive rhetoric and how to respond to aggressive argumentation. The American Bar Association featured an analysis of the confrontation in their monthly news, praising Jonathan's demonstration of how to maintain dignity and articulate a compelling case under immense pressure, even as a non. Perhaps most importantly, the confrontation became a teaching about the difference between performative aggression and substantive, empathetic engagement. Political science professors across the country found themselves using the Bondi Roumie exchange, a case study in effective communication and the unexpected power in public debate. Students today are used to political figures who communicate primarily through Twitter fights and cable news shouting, explained Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who teaches political communication. Seeing someone like Jonathan Roumie demonstrate that you can be forceful and effective while maintaining dignity professionally and doing so from a deeply human perspective is incredibly valuable for the next generations and citizens. The long-term implications of the confrontation continued to unfold over the following. Jonathan Roumie found himself invited to universities, interfaith conferences, and leadership seminars across the country. His approach to the Bondi confrontation became a template that others, both inside and outside of politics, began studying and attempting. 3 months after the CNN appearance, when Jonathan was profiled in Time magazine's Voices of Influence issue, he reflected on what had happened that day. "I think people are tired of the anger," and he told the They want voices that can stay calm under pressure, who can respond to attacks with facts and deeply held principles instead of insults, who can turn confrontation to a conversation about what really matters, our shared humanity and the pursuit of justice with compassion. When asked if he had any regrets about how he handled Bondi's outburst, Jonathan was characteristically thoughtful. "I regret that we've created a public culture where that kind of behavior is considered normal, but I don't regret responding with truth, with empathy, and maintaining my composure." Someone has to model what true integrity and a different kind of strength actually look like. The Bondi-Roumie confrontation ultimately became just a viral moment or a public relations victory. It became a symbol of what American public discourse could be if diverse voices focused on substance over performance, empathy over fear, and dignity over destruction. 6 months later, when CNN hosted another panel discussion on criminal justice reform, the network made sure to book guests who could discuss these substantive respectfully, rather than simply generate heat. The Bondi-Roumie effect had changed not just how public figures approached confrontation, but how media outlets thought about their responsibility to facilitate actual debate rather than merely providing entertainment. As we continue to navigate increasingly polarized, the lesson of that studio remains relevant and powerful. Sometimes the most effective response to someone trying to shout you down is to speak more clearly and compassionately, not more loudly. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to refuse to fight on your opponent's terms and instead change the conversation entirely, rooting it in universal human value. What did you think of Jonathan Roumie's response? Do you believe this kind of calm, empathy-based approach is more effective than fighting fire with fire? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible moments reshaping public. The next confrontation could be even, and you won't want to.